welcome to section 3 of macroeconomics. I will go faster this section, I promise. In this section, we're going to talk about things like unemployment rate, gross domestic product, GDP, and inflation, our favorite, right? So in those three topics, we can see the performance of the nation. That's what we're trying to see, not performance of individual markets like gasoline or milk markets, performance of the nation. The first thing that we're going to check out is the gross domestic product. To understand what gross domestic product is, it's either the output, or the total income of the nation's citizens, either the total output or total income. And the U.S. has grown since 1900 to the present, and we have to memorize this. The real output for the GDP of the U.S. economy has been increasing by a factor of nearly 40. Now that's very impressive. We're one of the only nations that is actually able to do that. But with ups and downs, two of the up and down is decline in output between 1929 and 1933. That's the Great Depression, 1929 to 1933. And also 1941 to 1945, which is World War II, where there's an industrial boom because all the unemployed now got a job in the war industry. The next one is to actually define what GDP is. So how do you calculate GDP exactly? It's the total amount of consumption plus investment plus governmental spending plus exports minus imports. This equals Y, GDP. This is called the consumption formula. How much do you consume in total? So let's add another over here, consumption. It's either output, income, or consumption. Those are the three ways you calculate GDP, and they should be equal to each other because one person's spending on consumption is another person's income. Doesn't matter if they're rich or they're poor. You buying something on Amazon could be the income of the seller, or it could be the income of Jeff Bezos. They're also income. And then we use this, which is the total output of the economy, showing the total health of the economy, if it's growing or not. And we use it to calculate GDP per capita. So what is GDP per capita? Well, per capita, we have to realize, is a Latin term, and they actually tested on this. It's a Latin term that names per head, which is per person. So, in other words, it's just GDP divided by the total population. And we also, what we call this is also the average output per capita, because realize that this is consumption. This could also be output, as this identity that we have established over here. It is also output. You have to output in order to consume, or else you're consuming nothing. So we have to take into account of output. So this is output really divided by the general population. And what we call this is the average labor productivity. In measuring how much an actual laborer can actually produce. So as we can see, the average labor productivity actually increases hand in hand with output per capita, showing that this is actually a established similarity. And over here, let's demonstrate what we have talked about before. This is the Great Depression, starting from 1930, 1929 really, Black Friday and Black Thursday, up to a World War. This is a World War peak, where there's a production peak. They're also later on going to talk about this drop, which is the 2008 financial crisis, but not yet. And we have to memorize another statistics here, which they could change as time goes on. Average output per person in the U.S. economy in 2019 was over $65,000. And to put this into perspective, they also have us memorize another data, which could be changing based on which year you're watching this video. Despite having a population 5 times of the United States, China's population is 5 times that of the United States. Its output, total production, is only 2/3 that of the United States, which means that despite having more people, their total production, China's total production, is still less than the United States' total production. And the per capita output is only 15% as large as the United States, which means that on a per person basis, US people who are living in the US can, compared to people in China, an average person in China can only produce 15% that of what a US person can produce. And if you compare it to an even, well, technically they're the most populous country now, India, their output per capita is only 3.2% that of a person in the United States, even worse. So that's a comparison between developing countries and the developed country of the United States. And economies that are developed, we have to remember, are United States, Japan, but there are still people living in poverty, of course. This is not a total reflection of the wealth gap, but it is a reflection, of course, on how the material resource is at least on a basis of development more for the United States compared to China and India. And it's usually true when reflecting those living qualities. And then we look at recessions and expansions, which we talked about before. What is an expansion? Well, it's a period between a peak and a trough. This word is actually pronounced trough. So the US actually has been experiencing mostly just expansions. Looking at those graphs, looking at this graph, it's just expansions. This is a period of expansion. This is expansion. This is expansion. Now, what are recessions? Recessions is periods like this: 2008 financial crisis, the Great Depression, which is technically all depressions are recessions, just a really bad recession. As we can see over here, what we talked about again, 1929 to 1933, the Great Depression, the most severe period of economic decline. And expansion is a peak and a trough, which basically, if we have a sine wave over here for the production, then the expansion is between the peak, this is a peak, and a trough. So this area right here, this increasing area right here is expansion. This is referred to as the business cycle. The business cycle. What is a business cycle? Well, a business cycle is basically, as you can see, it can have a recession, which means that it's doing worse and worse. It's producing less and less. But eventually, it reaches a point of which it can't get any more worse, so it gets better. It gets better and better, starts expanding. And at this point, it starts as a boom, which means that it reached its peak point, and now it have to go down again in recession. So, in other words, all economies is in two states. You can either be in a recession or in an expansion, at least within the context of this economic packet. That is the business cycle. We're looking at these kind of graphs. These kind of business cycles, when we're looking at this graph, there is a thing called real GDP. Now, what's the difference? What's a real GDP? Well, it's the opposite of a nominal GDP. It's gross domestic product that measures a total quantity of goods and services produced in the economy. Here's the important part: that removes the effect of inflation. Different from a nominal GDP, real GDP does not have the effects of inflation in it. What is inflation? Well, we'll talk about that later on over here. But right now, you need to know that. Actually, let's talk about it right now. Inflation is basically, over time, the prices rises. Why does prices rise? Well, because of a variety of factors, such as increasing in money supply. But we just have to know that when there is inflation, everything in the market gets more expensive. And usually, inflation comes with expansions rather than recessions. During an expansion, inflation goes up. In other words, every single one. Doesn't matter if you're gasoline, doesn't matter if it's medical expenses, doesn't matter if it's medicine, doesn't matter if it's orange juice. Every single price goes up. So it's a uniform increase in price. So in other words, you don't have to produce more for inflation. You just have to, say, increase the price tag, which is not very helpful in assessing how much the economy is actually producing, but how much price you're actually putting on the price tag. Therefore, that's why it is important for us, if we want to actually measure the output of the economy, to use the real GDP rather than the nominal GDP that is not adjusted for inflation. And finally, let's talk about unemployment. What is unemployment? It's the percentage of labor force that would like to work but cannot find employment. Notice that it's not every single person who doesn't have a job. For example, I'm 18. I don't have a job, but do I want to work right now? No, I want to go to college. So I'm not unemployed because I'm not looking for work. I'm looking to go into a college, and that's not work. So in other words, for you to be unemployed, you would have to actually want to look for work. There is more constraints as to how someone can be unemployed, and we'll get into that a little bit later. They'll talk about different types of unemployment, but not right now. Right now, you have to know that unemployment rate is never zero. It's impossible, unless if you're in a central authoritarian communist country, it will never be zero in our system. Usually for the United States is 4, 5, 6%, somewhere near that. And when the unemployment is high, it's hard to find work. Like the Great Depression, it's kind of hard to find work since Great Depression. But there are also other unemployments that is actually normal. That should happen to indicate a healthy economy. And circling back to inflation, let's look at how inflation is during a depression. Previously, we mentioned that with expansion, inflation will increase. Now, with recessions and depressions, such as the Great Depression and the 2008 financial crisis, the inflation will decrease and the prices will drop. So that's an interesting phenomenon that happens during depression and recessions. International trade. And international trade, we have talked about before, is trying to make your consumption possibility above the production possibility frontier. And what we have to know is that international trade has generally been increasing since 1950, but the level of exports and imports as a share of GDP has fallen over the past few years in the United States. So it's not fallen since 1950, it's fallen over the past few years. As we can see, over the past few years, there's a small decline since 2010. And next, there is two types of situation that you can be in when you're in trade. One is trade surplus, of which you are exporting more than you're importing. So trade is actually adding to your GDP. If you're running a trade deficit, in this case, you're actually having more imports than exports. So you're getting more in versus exporting out to other countries. So in this case, trading would actually decrease the amount of GDP that you're currently having. And here's another thing that you have to memorize about this. Up to until late 1950s, the United States has generally exported more than it imported. In other words, it's running on a trade surplus. But since the 1970s, the relationship has reversed, where the imports are more than exports. In this case, we are now running on a trade deficit, and we can see it over here. We can see that from this point, about 1970, around this point, imports, which is represented by the orange line, has been higher than this blue line, which is exports. But before, generally, this blue line, as we can see, is mostly higher than the orange line. The next part is gross domestic product, and here we actually define what gross domestic product actually is, and they actually have very specific definitions. A very short definition is the market value of all final goods and services that are produced within a country during a specific period of time. Now, there are many components to that, and let me explain each one. First of all, what's market value? The market value is basically the combination of price, which is times the quantity that you have produced. So different types of things in a country. So we use their dollar value and add them up. We use price times our total quantity for each good and add up however many goods that they are. However many goods that they are, we all add them up. And that is our market value. But notice that we won't add up all the goods. We will just add up the final goods, which is the second section here. Now, what are final goods? Can there be non-final goods? Yes. The definition of final good is that anything that is not intermediary. In other words, the things that you sell to consumers. For example, a phone. A phone is a final good. You sell these to consumers. But is phone camera lenses? Are the camera lenses supposed to be final goods when you're going to put them in are those camera lenses a final good? They're not a final good because you're going to put them into the phone. They're called what's called an intermediary good. In other words, the steel frame of the phone, if the phone is made out of steel frame or titanium frame, whichever frame this is, the steel that was originally produced will not be counted. The steel that's originally used to produce this phone will not be counted in the GDP because it's an intermediate good. It will be an intermediate in the production process of the phone that goes into the hands of the consumer. Now, there is a specific category that does not fit into either final good or intermediate good, and those are capital goods. Usually, capital goods are just machines. For example, like a furnace or a table that you put the furnace on. Now, those are machines and equipment. And even we can say things like buildings. But these capital equipments are counted, therefore, so in the year that they're made, because we don't really know if that's intermediary because we are using it to produce stuff, but technically they're not used up in the process. So they're not going to the consumer, so it's not a final good either. So we counted in the year they're produced. For example, if I have a furnace that's produced in the year 2007. If this is a 2007 furnace, then we only count this in 2007. We only count this furnace in the GDP of 2007. We do not count this as part of the GDP in any part of the later process. And next is within the country. Since this is domestic, the word domestic in the gross domestic product shows that it can be only within the country. If you're calculating the US GDP, you can't calculate it using the things that are produced in the UK, unless if it's actually imported. And finally, during a specific period. This is basically, usually, you have to specify the time frame of which you're summing up your GDP. Are you summing it up in a quarterly manner? In other words, you divide the year into 3 months, 3-month summary of GDP, or are you taking it in a year? Usually it's a year. The year's gross domestic product. So you have to specify a time frame in order to actually have a calculation on the gross domestic product. And those are the things that are all parts of the definition of gross domestic product. If they do not fit this definition, then they will not be able to be part of gross domestic product measures, because it is important to understand what is the meaning behind it. But first, a history lesson that we have to memorize. The measurement of GDP was developed in 1930 by Sir William Petty. In the mid 1600s, the guy named Sir William Petty, although this is in 1930s, he helped the British government to assess how much the Irish people is willing to pay taxes. Very befitting of a person named Petty. Now, during the Great Depression, the U.S. Department of Commerce commissioned this economist, Simon Kuznets. And Kuznets is the person who obviously was this 1930s guy, and notice that this is Great Depression. Great Depression, the U.S. Department of Commerce has issued Simon Kuznets to give a system that measures this output. National output. So Kuznets got a system and reported this to the U.S. Senate in 1934. And the U.S. entry into the Second World War, give an additional impetus to perfect these techniques and get the data. And in 1971, he was presented with the Nobel Prize of Economics. So in this case, all we have to know is that during the Great Depression, this guy Simon, he got a method of measuring GDP and got a Nobel Prize in 1971. And that this guy is Sir William Petty, pretty easy last name to remember, is the first guy to actually use some form of this. Although it's not really widespread after his use, it is very widespread after Simon's use. But however good it is, we have to realize that all tools has limitations. So the first limitation is that it's not very easy to determine what is actually final. That, for example, as the machinery that we have discussed before, machinery, obviously, you are using them right now, but you're not using them up. So are they actually final goods, or are they not final goods? The fact that we can't tell if they're final goods or not final goods, so that we have to add them into the first year, that's a problem, because we're still using them in the later years, and they're still adding value to us in the later years. And the second limitation is what it actually doesn't count. In other words, it doesn't count things that are not bought or sold in the markets. What does this mean? Black markets. It's basically non-market production. If you're producing not in the market, unpaid housework performed by family members freely, those are not counted in the GDP, even though it actually is a service that could be purchased in the market and is a labor performed by the people. And here we have to note that in the past 60 years, women have increasingly entered the paid workforce, which could be a reason why our GDP is rising a lot when our domestic household service is dropping, as what this statement is suggesting. And the next one is the final limitation. The third limitation of GDP, is that it really ignores things such as pollution. For example, let's say producing 10,000 tons of steel. You add 10,000 tons of steel multiplied by their price and put them in our GDP. Let's say they're all final goods. But that 10,000 tons of steel created a pollutant in the river that took you about $5,000 to clean up. Now, that $5,000, which is damage, isn't exactly subtracted from the original production of the steel, because it causes a natural depletion. Or let's say cutting down trees. Cutting down trees, we're not really accounting for the loss of trees or the damage to the environment. So the GDP doesn't care about the environment at all. That's another one of the limitations of the GDP. And there are other ways to measure GDP, of course, and a lot of ways to measure GDP. As we mentioned before, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. That's one of the ways to measure the GDP, of which this is consumption, investment, governmental spending, and NX, which is exports minus imports. Understand what each of the letter actually mean. When we talk about consumption, we're talking about when consumers buy stuff. They could be either consumer durables, which are long goods that last long, like automobiles, and furniture. Automobiles and furniture last a very long time. And they're also consumer non-durables here, which are used up quickly, like food and clothing, the clothes that you wear. And also services can also count as goods, such as things like education, legal services, insurance, financial services. Notice that they didn't include houses. The reason why is because houses is, in our next topic, investments. Because there's many types of investment actually. There's called fixed investment, capital investment, and also residential investments, and inventories. So there's 4. Or 3 if you count both of these as the same thing, since business fixed investment and capital investment is counted as the same thing. And business fixed investment is basically when the business try to buy factories, offices, machinery, equipments. Those are pretty durable usually, and they need these to output supply. Residential fixed investment is just homes and apartment buildings, places that you live in. And inventories is unsold goods. Basically goods that are left over after a sales season. And an important thing to know again about investment is what it actually doesn't count. Things like stocks and bonds, they do not count. Those two do not count as investment. Now, a lot of people may think that these are investment, but they are not investment counted into the GDP, because when someone invests in a stock, they're not generating any good or service. They're not using it as a good and service, so it is not counted in the GDP. And we also have to know that this is the purchases of new homes. They're not purchases of old homes. For example, if I were to buy a 1900 home that costs me about $500,000, that is not counted in the GDP. Maybe the salesman's service is counted into the GDP, but as for the home, that's built in 1900s. If I buy, however, a home that's built this year, then that will be counted into the GDP, and that's good. Finally, governmental purchases. Governmental purchases is mainly just when the government buys goods or pays the government workers. Wages paid to firefighters, for example, and teachers. They can buy things, purchase goods and services. The government can also do that. However, it is also important to know that government purchases also excludes a lot of things. For example, the government purchases will exclude things like transfer payments. Social Security benefits will not be part of the GDP. Why? Because people have been paying into Social Security all their life. It's just the government giving that amount of money back. So that is not considered as part of the GDP. Now, net exports. This is another one of the things that were counted into the GDP, and their exports, which are goods that are sold to foreigners, minus exports minus imports. And if imports is bigger than exports, then this net export will lower the GDP. But if there's a trade surplus where you're exporting more than you import, then its contribution to the GDP will be positive. And then we have another way to measure GDP. And as for the reason why there is so many ways to measure GDP, recount that we have talked about out here, that output equals income equals consumption. Right now we have discussed how the output can measure GDP. Now we're about to discuss how the income and the consumption can measure GDP, because they should ultimately equal each other. One person's spending is another person's is another person's income, because when you spend on something, that pays the company, that pays the people that is serving under that company. We also have discussed the consumption method. So let's look at the income method. How do we use income? You actually do not need to know how to use this income. You just need to know that GDP equals production equals expenditure equals income. Production, which is just adding up all the goods produced in the economy. Expenditures, which is the method that we have discussed over here, C plus I plus G plus NX. And income, which is supposed to be equal to the expenditure. So if the test ever asks you, if it ever gives you the GDP as expenditure, know that you already know the income and production. You do not need to memorize the formula for income and production, which is good. Next topic is real GDP. So what is real GDP? Real GDP is just GDP adjusted for inflation. Over here, real GDP, in contrast to nominal GDP, which is GDP that is not adjusted for inflation. Now, can nominal GDP be the same as real GDP? Yes. But let me show you how to get the real GDP first so that it becomes apparent. So how you get to the real GDP is first you set a current year. Let's say your current year is 2025. Or let's say current year is 20 to make matters simpler. Your base year in this case, your base year is 5. In this case, what you're going to do is that you're going to find the prices of those goods that you produced in year 20, in year 5, and say the price of shoes is $3 in year number 5, or let's just call it 2005. $3. Now you produced 10 shoes in the year 2020. Let's make this 05. 10 shoes. So what is your GDP? Your GDP is $30, and that's your real GDP. But how do you get the nominal GDP of 2020? Well, let's say the nominal price, which is right now, the price of shoes have experienced inflation and gone up to $4 per shoe. So your nominal GDP in the year of 2020 is $40. But your real GDP with 2005 as your base year, which is the year that you're taking the price from, and you always need a base year when calculating for this real GDP, is $3. Therefore, you use the $3 to multiply by the $10 to get the real GDP. But let's say you actually want to get the real GDP of 05 as your base year. So the current year right now is no longer 2020, it's 05. Wait, can your current year and your base year be the same? Yes, it could, but it doesn't really yield much meaningful result. But let's just do this for the sake of proving that your nominal GDP can actually be equal to real GDP. So let's say in 05 you produced 5 shoes. In this case, since your base year is 05, you take the price from 05, it is 5 times 3, $15. Your 05 real GDP as 05 was your base year is $15. But if you notice, even if we're to use the current year as 05 to calculate this nominal GDP, it would still be $15 because we would still be taking the price from the current year, which is the same thing as base year. In this case, the real GDP amount of inflation that you have to adjust for depends on which base year that you choose. We have learned what real GDP is. It's without inflation, but how exactly do you get inflation? This is where you come to a tool called Consumer Price Index, and this is something you have to memorize. It's measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics using the Consumer Expenditure Survey. They use this survey to ask what are people likely to buy and how much money they are likely to spend on it, to calculate the cost of living expenses. And what you use is this formula over here. CPI in year T is the cost of bundle in that year T divided by the cost of bundle in the base year. In this case, you have to remember that the test probably will want you to remember multiply by 100 so that they do not get a number that's less than 100. Unless if their CPI current year is actually less than the base year. Now, let's say our current year is this year. How exactly do we calculate the CPI? Well, we use 2014 as a base year, and this is the total amount of quantity. We multiply the quantity times the amount of times the price, of which it would give us 20, 15, 25, and the total cost of these items would be $60 in 2014. But remember, this is just the base year cost. In other words, we just derive the cost of the bundle in the base year. We still need to derive the cost in the current year, which is what we actually want. So we do the multiplication, find the cost of the pants, find the cost of the t-shirts, find the cost of the shoes, and we arrive at this number, 106. So what we do is that now we find the current year for the same bundle of goods, 106 divided by 60. That gives us this number right over here, 176.7, after you multiply this by 100. So that's how you use the CPI. It's a bundle of goods that households are likely to buy in a year. Now there's actually another way that you can calculate inflation. Let's see if we can find it. Yes, over here. GDP deflator. Now GDP deflator is something that's very different from the CPI, and unlike what is over here, production equals expenditure equals income, it does not equal CPI, because the CPI is specific to the consumer. In other words, specific for the C over here, in the GDP. But GDP deflator, it takes into account of everything, the entire GDP. So this is more generally applicable. In this case, how do we measure it? Nominal GDP equals GDP deflator divided by 100 times real GDP. To understand this equation, we need to know what GDP deflator actually is. This is calculated mainly by this will be mainly derived from 100 times nominal GDP divided by real GDP. So you just have to remember it's nominal GDP without adjusted for inflation, divided by real GDP. Now what use of it would it be if we can't just use this to reach this, nominal GDP? It seems like we use the term to define itself. Well, we don't need to know the nominal GDP, really. Well, we actually do, but we're not trying to derive it. If we're trying to derive inflation, then this deflator will be enough, because this deflator will give us an index from 100 or up. And usually the nominal GDP is above the real GDP, because there usually is not a deflation, unless if it actually asks you to identify a deflation. So if it's below 100, if deflator is below 100, then it is a deflation situation. If it's above 100, then it's a inflator situation. In this case, we just use the way we would normally derive the GDP, which is not setting up a base year, and use the current year prices times the current year quantities, and then divided by the one that actually uses the base year price times the current year quantity. And don't forget to multiply this all by 100, because it doesn't want to be a decimal usually. So that's GDP deflator. But there is an actual problem with CPI and GDP deflator, well, mostly with CPI, that it's not very accurate. Just like GDP, it could be inaccurate. Now the problem with the GDP deflator is mostly just the same problem with the GDP itself, because it's derived from GDP itself. But what we have to know for the CPI is that it have another reason to be inaccurate. For example, unmeasured quality change. The goods and services can have quality changes. For example, would you like to use an iPhone 5? Probably not at this point. iPhone 5 is probably not very attractive. But the prices of iPhone has generally risen, but is that only due to the idea that the phones is still the same, the amount of things is still the same, but just the price has risen? Not really. It could be because of technology improvements that actually make the good better. So we didn't account for that. We just accounted for the cost of living expenses. We didn't account for the technology maybe getting better, therefore it is reasonable for them to charge more. So it's very hard to actually predict this. And the second thing is substitution. Actually, this is the first thing up here, substitution. What does this mean? That means that, for example, inferior goods and normal goods. If we're not flexible in the CPI, when our income drops, or when the prices of goods rises, let's say we have actually Pepsi and cola. The price of Pepsi rises. Now CPI accounted for Pepsi. So it's like, oh, look at Pepsi, its cost rise, therefore CPI must rise. But it doesn't account for the consumers looking at Pepsi, oh, the Pepsi's cost rise, I'll just switch to cola. I'll switch to, let's say cola in this situation is worse than Pepsi. I'll just switch to something that's worse. So in this case, the cost of living actually didn't rise at all. The quality of living may have dropped because they chose a worser drink. Not stating any personal opinions, they chose a worser drink, but in this case, really, the cost of living really didn't raise at all, so the CPI has overestimated, again, how much impact does the increase in CPI actually is. And the third one is the new goods and services. That's the third issue with the GDP that doesn't account that it doesn't account for. For example, it used the cell phone example too. Let's say you're in the 1970s, mid 1970s, they were introduced. And back then, the cell phone is not really that popular, therefore, not part of the CPI. Not part of the CPI. But the cost of buying this kind of cell phone is really, really high. Lots of money needed to buy the cell phone. In this case, that's an issue because it's not counted when the price actually drops. Because this price will drop over the years as you become more efficient at producing the cell phone. Because in 1970s, this cell phone is an exotic piece of scientific equipment that only the top labs can get their hands on. But now it's an everyday equipment, so it's nothing to be flaunted of. In this case, it doesn't account for this drop in price. It only accounts for it after it actually is popular, but it doesn't account for it when it's not popular, and it doesn't account for its drop in price. So that again overestimated the GDP. So there's something that you have to memorize. 1996, the Boskin Commission, have an economist named Michael Boskin, has reviewed the CPI method, and they found that the CPI overstated the rate of price inflation by 1.3% each year. This is something that you have to memorize. So that's all for inflation. We have already talked about how the nominal GDP, the GDP deflator take into account of the entire GDP that is measured and calculated, and CPI only cares about the consumer part. So that's why it diverges. And if we look at this graph, over here it diverges in this year. And remember what happened in this year, 1970s, the OPEC oil crisis. This is what happened over here. And why is that? This is because although it only cares about the consumers also buy foreign goods, and that foreign good is oil. Now, GDP doesn't care about oil because oil is mostly foreign produced at that point. And a lot of oil is still foreignly produced and not domestically produced. In other words, this oil is factored into the price of consumer price index, but not factored into the price of the GDP deflator. So that's the first difference of the reason why GDP deflator actually is growing slower than the CPI. It's because of oil, and that oil is actually foreign, not domestic. And second, the CPI uses a fixed market basket of goods. GDP deflator does not use a fixed basket of goods. It doesn't use anything fixed besides the base year. It weighs the prices by their current level of production. In other words, your level of production could be very different going from year to year. About unemployment in a deeper level. Unemployment, first we have to memorize what the BLS actually surveys when it tries to find the unemployment rate. It surveys 60,000 households on a series of questions to classify every person that is 16 or older into those three categories: employed, unemployed, out of the labor force. Employed is someone that works for a paid job, full-time or part-time, the previous week, or is vacation or sick. So if you're on vacation or you're sick, therefore, or on sick leave, so that's why you're not working currently, you're still employed. How you get to be unemployed is if you did not work during the previous week. If you didn't work in the past week and you are trying to you made an effort to find paid employment in the past 4 weeks, that's when you're unemployed. But there is actually a third category, out of the labor force. If the person is not working in the past week and did not actively seek to work in the previous 4 weeks, for example, I never tried to find a job in the previous 4 weeks, neither did I work in the past week, I'm out of the labor force. I'm not even unemployed because I didn't make an attempt to even find a job. So those are three categories of which the BLS tries to categorize humans in their level of working. Now, here's a rate that we also have to know: labor force participation rate, which is 61.4%. Here's something that you have to remember: 61.4%. And in the labor force, 143.5 million had jobs, and 16.3 million are unemployed. And when was this exactly? It's July 2020. And 260 million working age persons in the United States were surveyed. In other words, anyone that is 16 or older. And 160 million is in the labor force, which is how they arrived at the number 61.4. That's a formula that you have to memorize. And the unemployment rate based on the 16.3 million who are not unemployed is 10.2%. Not a really great look. 1 year earlier, we had to know that, which is 2019, the unemployment rate was only 3.4%. this is mainly because the COVID-19 pandemic driving everyone out of work, which is something that happened quite recently, if you can call it that. And there are three broad categories. Now we have finished discussing some history of unemployment. We can look at three categories: frictional, structural, and cyclical. So what do you need to know about frictional? Frictional is people who are either they got laid off of their job or they quit. They quit their job or laid out of their job. Or are students who are new job seekers. Those people take time to find job. It's reasonable that they won't find a job instantly because we're not under a supercomputer AI surveillance dystopia. Those people takes time to find job because they're humans. So frictional unemployment applies when taking into account of the time of which people need to take to find jobs. So this is normal. This is normal. And structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is skill mismatches. For example, let's say you are a computer programmer that uses the language of C. Now, a lot of company is like, I don't want C anymore. I want C++ programmers. I want C++ programmers. I don't want C. So in this case, they don't want you there, so you're structurally unemployed. You have a skill, but technically, this companies has moved on from your language. It's not really a fault of the economy. They're just advancing. So this is normal. You have to learn C++ from now on if you actually want to participate in the economy in the further progression of the economy. Next is cyclical unemployment. This is not normal. This is bad. This is recessionary. This is what happens when layoffs are happening, new hires decline, and job seekers find it harder to find employment, not due to the fault of their own, not because it actually takes time to find jobs, but because the companies are doing bad so that they cannot afford to hire this much people anymore. This is cyclical unemployment. Companies not being able to afford to hire people. In this case, this is outside what's called a natural rate of unemployment. Over here, it says the natural rate of unemployment. Natural rate of unemployment is basically the frictional. Natural rate of unemployment equals frictional plus structural unemployment. Those two are the normal unemployment, so they're natural. This one is recessionary, so it's outside of this NRU, outside of the natural unemployment rate. That's why cyclical is just so bad for the economy. The next is living standards. How does economic growth trigger living standards? Well, the thing that you have to mainly know here is that the GDP per capita has been grown by a factor of 9 between 1900 and 2019. Why is this important? This is important because this means that this is GDP per capita, real GDP per capita. We have known that the GDP actually grown 40 times at this from 1900s to 2019, but the real GDP per capita we can see has grown 9 times. This means that the living standard, the amount of average people's earnings has increased by 9 times, and we can actually see it through, nowadays we have movies, we have travel from United States and Europe to a single day, televisions, computer, antibiotics. We enjoy all these things that people in the 1900s does not enjoy. That's why economic growth, looking at economic growth per capita is a great sign of living standards improving. Next one is circular flow model. Circular flow model basically look at what is depicted in figure 42. All you have to memorize about this is that there is 4 major actors: households, government, firms, and the market. There's 2 markets: markets for goods and services, markets for factors of production. The households work here, and the factories pay this market so that people work. This market will go into these households as income. Households pay taxes to the government. Firms also pay taxes for the government because they get revenue from this market down here, because the goods that are produced here goes into the goods and services market and they return to the firms as revenue. The households spend their income here. When firms receive revenue, they pay taxes. The government gives public goods and services. Public goods and services, the government also buys from this market, of which also gives this firms more revenue. Sometimes the government will make transfer payments, and that's basically the gist of circular flow model. The arrows indicates the flow of money, where the money, follow the money, right? And the thicker arrow is the supply inputs, and of course humans is also an input, factor of production. Humans are actually factor of production, the labor production. So that's basically the gist of circular flow model. Now, the next thing we need to know is this formula. This formula over here, what is this formula trying to say? Well, it's mainly trying to show you that the GDP per capita can be separated into two things. What do those two things represent? This is pretty much, we can disregard this because it doesn't represent anything really. It just represents how many people are in the labor force, really. So it's not really something that we need to memorize too much. It's how many people are in the labor force out of the entire population. This is the important part. This is measuring how much GDP can a person in the labor force produce, not just the entire population. A person in the labor force, a laborer, in other words, how efficient a laborer actually is in the economy, not how efficient everyone is in the entire country. So that's why this separating the GDP per capita is so important, so that we can see how much is a person actually producing. Is one person producing the entire wealth of the nation, or is 80% of the population producing the wealth of nation? And over here we look at different types of capitals. Those kind of capitals are the things that you use to figure out how productive, what is the average labor productivity. This have a very specific name, and it is over here. Average labor productivity. So how do we know that this average labor productivity is going to be increasing or decreasing? Well, there are a few things. Physical capital, human capital, natural resources, technological knowledge, and political and legal environment. Let's give some examples of physical capital. Well, physical capital is basically pretty much a lot similar to the technological knowledge. You use technology to get more advanced equipment, and if you have more advanced equipment, you have a higher average labor productivity, because a laborer that is using a machine is obviously usually more efficient than a laborer that's using crafting things by hand. Next is human capital. Human capital is mostly about how skilled a human are and how educated they are. Basically, if you're not too educated on a particular job, for example, if you asked me to go to a restaurant and cook, I don't know how to cook, I would not be a great human capital in production. How to increase my productivity, average labor productivity, is to teach them how to cook. Teach people who want to go to work in restaurants how to cook. Next is natural resources. Obviously, you need resources in order to actually produce things. If you have no resources, then you cannot produce things. Of course, the different countries produce different things. For example, Russia. A lot of their GDP come from selling natural gas, because they got a whole lot of natural gas in their economy. That runs their economy. So they depend on countries like China, Europe, and India to buy their natural gas. That is actually part of the wealth of their nation. Next is technological knowledge, which goes hand in hand in the physical capital realm, of which workers are, whether it depends on if they're giving them better tools to work with. Just like having a machine is for wood carving is obviously better than just having a knife for wood carving, and more efficient in this case. And finally, the political and legal environment. In this case, it actually gives some of the examples. A lot of high productivity countries, such as the United States, are learned and copied. And who are the countries that copied it? Japan, South Korea, China. They catched up quickly by successfully borrowing the United States techniques in production. However, there is still poverty in that country. Why exactly is that? This is because, as we can see, there's things like North Korea. What happens to North Korea is that they refuse to trade and they refuse to open up. They do adapt somewhat, but they are quite dysfunctional. They're very dysfunctional politically because of their absolute dictators and refusals to adapt. And we can see that how much North and South Korea has diverged from each other by a whole lot because of North Korea's system. So we know that if there's an example of political and legal environment making economy more or less effective in their average labor productivity, we can use North Korea as an example of not being so productive. The next is, we're talking about investment, and the main form of investment in making average labor productivity better is research and development. R&D is desirable. This counts as investment. Things like knowledge can be acquired, human capital can be acquired, and this is what's called a true public good. If the test asks you what a true public good is, that's knowledge. Because just because I know something doesn't diminish the fact that you can also know it, doesn't diminish the fact that that person can also know it. It's basically that this discovery is purely something that is non-rival and also not excludable. Although it could be excluded by things like copyrights, it's not going to be excluded forever. So that's why the government is so interested in research and development and offers things like tax credits, subsidies, and direct expenditures or legal protections, such as the patent system, which we mentioned before, to give people a temporary monopoly so that they can be encouraged to invent. And that's one of the main reasons of the capitalist system even existing. Is saving, investment, and the financial system. So what is this thing trying to say? Well, the main point here is that what do we mean by saving? What do we mean by investment? And what do we mean by it being in the financial system? So the financial system consists of mainly financial markets. What are those two markets? The bond market and the stock market. How do people save? Well, a way people save is when their income is bigger than their expenditure. The amount of money that you take in is bigger than the amount of money that you spend out. In this case, what would people do with this income? Do you put it into your walls or stuff it under the carpet? Not really. What you do is that you save it into the bank so that you can generate interest. You either save this into a bank, bonds, or stock. You put this into the bank, the bonds, or the stock to generate income. And those income would turn into, and those savings would turn into investment because the banks obviously are not allowing those monies to sit around. So they give those monies to the investors so that they can use those monies to work on their own projects. They can lend those monies from the banks to do things like tech startups and things like that. Those are for small businesses though. For large businesses, they do something called the bond market. Things like Walmart, large corporation, really large. And as we can see, it's something like some sort of an IOU with a date of maturity. It also have a rate of interest paid periodically until the loan is repaid, which means that this bond is basically just borrowing money from you. A big corporation borrowing money from you at a fixed or variable interest rate. Depends on the nature of the bond, how the bond actually works, of which the terminology and the explanation absolutely does not make sense. So let me make it make sense. So the principle of a bond is basically its face value. How much are they going to pay back? You lend them $1,000. After you give them that bond, they'll pay you back $1,000. But wait, you're going to ask, where's the interest? Well, the interest, they actually say after they describe the discount rate, but let's describe the interest first. The interest of what makes you interested in buying a bond is actually called coupon, as we can see coupon rates. Why is it called coupon instead of interest? Well, this is because originally when they issue a bond, they have little attached coupons, coupon-like things on here on the bond, on the original bond that you can rip off to go and redeem those interests. So you actually do get interest. It's just called coupon because that's what it originally was. But after coupon, there's also a thing called discount. When you're not selling it to, when you're selling a bond, the bond is usually sold at a discount. And the thing is, you're not actually redeeming this bond because the date of maturity has not reached it. You're selling it before the date of maturity. In this case, the discount is, for example, basically the price of the bond, how much you're going to sell it for. How much you're going to sell it for minus the date of maturity is a discount. In other words, if let's say your bond is actually $1,000 after interest, but you sell it for only $950. Why is that? Well, that usually is because the interest rate on your bond is 3%, let's say 3%, and the market inflation right now, actual interest, is 5%. What the usual interest would be 5%. So you're basically subtracting $50 from your original bond when you're selling it, which is the discount. The $50 is the discount when you're selling it before the date of maturity, because this 3%, you have to take into account that this 3%, they could have not taken your bond at all. They could have just say, I don't want this bond. I want another bond that I myself invest in that actually pays 5%, which is 2% more than whatever interest your bond is paying. But now I'm opting for your bond if you're willing to sell it for me $50 less than your original principal. So that's what it means by principal, discount, and coupon rates. And that's the gist of the bond. But obviously, not everything about the bond is great. There is interest, which means that the borrower may fail to pay some of the bond. In this case, it will be called a default, which is not a great look. But how do you make sure that you buy a bond that doesn't default? Well, you buy from the US government. We all know that the government always issue a bunch of bonds. That's how it arrived at $36 trillion of debt after all. It always sells bond, and it's a very safe credit risk because it have never failed to pay back ever, the US government. So it can actually lend out a very it can the downside is that when you actually buy US government bonds, the interest rate is really low. So, but it's safer, but the interest rate is low. The next part is the stock market. Now, differing from the bond, the stock market is not them lending borrowing money from you. You are actually buying part of the company. Let's say you buy one share of Walmart stock. Now you just owned, let's say this is how much shares of Walmart stock there is in total. This will be the amount of the company that you actually own. So you own part of the company. And this is called equity finance because the stocks in the balance sheet is called equity, and selling of a bond is a debt finance because bond is essentially the debt that the company has to pay off. And with regards to which one they actually pay off first, they are legally required to pay the bond market first if the business is failing before they are able to send out things like dividends in the stock market. And by buying a stock, you're either expecting to receive dividends from the company. That's the first thing you're for. The second is that you're betting on this company being able to be successful so that you can actually sell their bonds at a higher price. And where exactly do you buy stocks? Well, there is a formal markets. Things like New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, National Association of Security Dealers, and Automated Quotation System. Those are the places where you actually buys and sell stocks, which is, again, the prices is very, very formal here, and everyone is supposed to know how much the stock is supposed to worth. And the value of the stock, actually, let's talk about how the value of the stock is determined. It's determined by how good the company is doing. If the company is doing great, then the stock will have a very high price. If the company is doing bad or failing, the stock would be at a very low amount of value. What we discussed before sounds pretty risky, right? The stock market, the company can crash anytime it wants to. The bond market, they could default. So that sounds pretty risky. How do you actually avoid the risk? You go to things like banks and mutual funds. Those are what's called financial intermediaries. In other words, those are the people who deal between the consumers and the companies, the investors. They're the middleman. They're the third person. They deal between them. How exactly do banks deal between them? Well, the banks takes money. The banks takes money from the consumers and pay them in the forms of interest. They gave them interest on the money that they save in the banks. Now, the banks obviously have to live on something, so they also lend the money that you give them to investors so that investors later on can pay them the money that they were lended plus interest. Thereby, they earn money. The banks are able to earn money. Interest plus the money. So that's one way that bank can act as a safe intermediary between the two, especially with the regulations that are provided nowadays after the 2008 financial crisis of the risky behavior behind the banks. The next one is mutual fund. This is basically, it could be operating on the bond market or the stock market. It's a way for you to buy a lot of bonds from many different companies using very little money. It's basically pooling money. A bunch of investors just pool the money into one singular pool. And people with financial knowledge invest those type of money in a lot of companies, in numerous amount of companies. They invest them. In this case, if one company fails, as long as the general market does not fail, one company fails, they still can have another company still floating. In other words, you don't have to lose everything. If you just buy one company stock, for example, Walmart stock, or buy Walmart's bonds, if Walmart fails, you pretty much has no option left. So that's one thing that's good about mutual funds is diversification, diversifying your portfolio of stocks and bonds. The next discussion is going to be about savings and investment in aggregate. How exactly do we calculate savings? In other words, what is saving defined as? Saving is the money that you don't spend. Now, we can take a look at this equation. There is things like private savings and governmental savings, of which all uses the variables on here. And the way we look at it is that first let's derive what saving equals to. This is the equation for the GDP. We know that how much money do we actually spend? In this case, it is not used to, let's first assume that we're in a closed economy so that NX is not accounted for. So we move the consumption. Consumption is not the money that we save. Consumption is what we spend. So we subtract consumption. Is investment something that we spend? Well, it might look like it, but investment is actually something that we invest in the future. That's what the investment actually means. So investment money, although it buys stuff, it's for the future. Subtract government spending, it will equals investment. And since investment is basically saving for the future, we know that investment in this case, savings equal investment. And if you're in a closed economy, this portion also equals saving. That's what this section is trying to derive over here. Now, since we know that this entire thing equals saving, what happens if we add taxes? Well, taxes is a way the government actually earns money. The government just don't grab money out of thin air. It needs a way to earn money. So it tax people. So by taxing people, we can derive private savings and government savings. So basically, how much money you own as a government minus how much you spend as the government is the government savings. And how much money that you spend, how much yearly GDP there is, minus the consumption by the people, minus the amount of taxes that were taken. This gives us the private saving, because this technically is the income of the people. As we can see, output equals income, right? So Y equals income in this case, and this minus how much they actually spend their income, consumption, and how much the government takes from the consumers. And those two added together, the governmental plus the Y, the income minus C minus T, this gives us the total savings, the total amount of savings that is given. And also, if we look at this formula over here, if we look at this one, governmental saving, we can also derive two terms. One is called the budget surplus, of which if the T minus G is positive, then in that case the government is saving money, a government surplus, although that almost never happens, and a budget deficit, of which you're taxing less than you're spending. In this case, you have to borrow money. That's what happens, and that's what caused America to have $36 trillion of debt. Bringing international to the talk of savings, and also capital flows in an open economy. So the first thing we have to consider is net capital outflow. What is net capital outflow? It's basically the amount of investment that is going out. In other words, net capital outflow is the amount of capital outflow minus capital inflow. Does that remind us of something? That's right, net export. It's very similar to net exports, but in this case, it's specifically the money, the dollars, which are their currency, if we're considering America as our country. Net capital outflow. Let's give some examples of net capital outflow. Actually, this is an example of net capital inflow, but let's say this InBev, this country, is owning a brewing company. They purchased a U.S. company. In other words, they're investing in the United States. They're bringing money. They bought a U.S. company, therefore giving U.S. money. In this case, the net capital outflow is negative. It's going to be subtracted because this is money flowing into the country. It's not outflow anymore. But if Intel builds a new factory in Taiwan, which is making our money flow out to Taiwan, which investing in Taiwan, that is actually positive. Net capital outflow being positive. Now, there's two types of investments too. There's not just one, there's two. Investment that can lead to capital inflow or outflow. That's foreign direct investments and portfolio investments. Foreign direct investment is literally people buying or constructing things in America. For example, United States got the Rocket Center filler in New York, and the Japanese corporation Mitsubishi in 1989, they bought it. They bought this center. That's direct investment because they just bought an entire building. But what is portfolio investment? What portfolio actually means, as we have seen before in mutual funds, it's something related to bonds and stocks. In this case, it's actually the Chinese government buying US government bonds. In this case, they're investing in the US. The net capital outflow, therefore, is negative because the money is coming in rather than going out. Recognize one of the important identities here. NX equals NCO. They equal each other. Why is that? Because let's picture a scenario of which your company's exports is more than your imports. In this case, the other countries are buying more than they're giving you. Now, where exactly do they get that money? They have to borrow, right? Because they're buying more than they're selling. So, in that case, to match the amount of money that you're selling them, to match the amount of produce that you're selling them, they have to borrow money. Where do they borrow money? They have to borrow it from you because they're buying it from you. In this case, the net capital outflow will also be positive. And let's consider another scenario. You're importing more than you're exporting. In this case, where would you get that money? Because obviously your exports is not going to cover that amount. So you have to borrow from somewhere. Where do you borrow? You borrow from the outside. In this case, if you're borrowing from the outside, that's a portfolio investment. In that case, you have to, for example, the other countries have to get a portfolio investment on you. So they have to invest in your economy. They're investing money into your economy so that you can get more of their imports. So in this case, NX will always equal NCO. That's an important identity to remember. So now that we have this out of the way, let's consider what is the relationship between NCO and NX. Well, let's go to our original example, of which this is the original closed economy, and this is the open economy firm. Now we switch this into this. How exactly does that convert? Well, if we can get the CNI onto the CNG onto the other side, CNG to the other side, in this case we get rid of these two, what we're left with is that, if we remember this thing, is that's savings. That is savings. If that is savings, then it must equal investment, as we have seen before. But again, we have seen a new thing here. This is NX. This NX has also to be added over here because now we're in an open economy. And what exactly does this NX equals to? Well, this NX equals to NCO, as we proved over here. NX equals NCO. Therefore, this equation establishes as S equals investment savings, national savings equals investments plus net capital outflow. And that's the equation. That's how they get this equation. Pretty simple, right? So if people are willing to lend to us, that means that we're actually saving less. If people are not investing in us, we're investing in other countries, that actually means that we're still saving money. We're just investing it in other countries. And one thing important to realize about saving, things like investments being equal to saving, is that if we want to invest, we can't infinitely invest. The reason why is that although investment is great for economic growth, especially private investments, what happens when you invest too much is that you reduce your consumption so much that your living quality goes haywire, which is not something that you generally would want. Therefore, you have to actually limit how much you are going to save. But this identity still holds, so during tests, please remember this identity. Well, let's consider how the financial market actually considers saving and investment decisions. The thing is, the financial market, have a curve, shown in figure 44. They decide on this curve. Looks pretty similar to the demand and supply, right? The demand is still negative slope and the supply is still positively sloped. And if we look at over here, this is the equilibrium point, of which will be the best amount of savings and the best amount of interest to charge for the financial market. So this is actually how the financial market decides its real interest rate and the savings and investment quantity. But wait, did we just say real interest rate? Is there a fake interest rate? Well, not really, but there is a nominal interest rate, just like the GDP. So how exactly is that significant? Well, let's look at the Fisher equation over here. This is an equation that you have to memorize, although they didn't bold it. Real interest rate equals nominal minus inflation. Now, what does this mean? It's basically interest rate adjusted for inflation. Why do you need to adjust interest rate for inflation? Well, let's say I have a bond. I want to issue a bond. Now that this is going to be issued and people are going and I'm gonna pay out interest. Do you think people are gonna buy this bond if I just pay the amount of interest, the same thing as the inflation? Not a chance, because, well, maybe some people will, but a lot of people won't. This is mainly because the people are thinking, I'm not earning money here. My money is still staying the same. If you want to actually earn money, if you want to earn money on top of what you're currently getting, you have to get real interest rate, because let's say you give $1,000. The bond matures in a year, and the interest is 5%, and the inflation is 5%. What are you getting at the end of the year? Well, $1,050. Well, with, of course, to inflation, taking into account of inflation, you earn $0. But if you add real interest rate in there, you would earn money. That's why real interest rate in a savings market that actually wants to earn money is important. In this case, we can see that the equilibrium is about 5.5%, and this would be the amount of which people are willing to save, or in other words, invest in the economy, if this thing is at this amount of interest rate. Now let's consider, how can this graph be broken? Because there is one actor that can break this, and we pay taxes to it to break it. The government. How does it break an entire market? Well, the government is the only source that is powerful enough. It's called crowding out. How exactly does this happen? Well, think what happens when the government runs into the deficit. Well, if the government runs into deficit, I have to borrow money, right? Where exactly does the government borrow money? The savings market. But this means that the demand is going to shift. On this graph, we're going to see a demand, as we can see over here. The demand, because the government is also demanding those loans, the demand will shift to the right. The demand for investment, the demand for the savings. In this case, the interest rate would rise with accords to this. If you want to demand more, well, we're going to charge more. And the supply would rise, the quantity of savings would rise, but the interest rate will also rise. Now, what happens if interest actually rises? Now, it is a huge issue, and let me explain why that's a huge issue. If the interest rate were to rise, then let's say it rises to 8%. If it were to rise to this level, 8%, I, as a private investor, I'm looking at this and I'm like, I'm not doing it, because the real interest rate is basically the price of money. I'm not paying that high of an interest just to make my new technology and things like that. Therefore, it reduces the amount of private investment. So in other words, when the government is in a deficit and it's borrowed a lot of money from this financial market, it is causing the private investors to invest less in the economy, because they don't want to take this kind of real interest rate and run with it. They don't have the confidence that they're going to give that back. And of course, there are many ways that this financial market can shift. And also, to make things simple, let's just call this the loanable funds market, since this is the appropriate economic term for this. The loanable funds market, how exactly does the curve shift? Well, this first scenario over here is technological innovation. What can technological innovation do? Well, if there's technological innovation, the firms will be more happy. As in this case, we see if the firms are more happy, they're more likely to invest. In this case, the demand for the loans will be more. They would demand more for loans. In this case, interest would increase and demand curve shifts to the right, and that's okay. And the second is when the government saving goes down, which is what we have discussed earlier, crowding out, but this is the other aspect of it. This is the supply aspect of the effect of crowding out. This also, as we can see, increases the amount of interest rate, but how does it do it this time? Well, we have seen that the government saving equals T minus G. T minus G. In this case, if you're running into a deficit, the amount of savings is going down, so the supply of savings is also going down. In this case, it takes the government as actually a lender in the market. And in this case, the interest rate would still rise and would still cause crowding out. So that's two aspects of how the government can actually cause things like crowding out. The last one is tax credit. This one is a shift of the supply curve to the right. What tax credit is that it allows people to basically pay less taxes. And if you're issuing tax credit, if people save, then obviously people are more likely to save, and now you got more supply of loans left. Therefore, the supply curve of the amount of savings, or should I say the amount of money available to invest, increases. And those are the three main ways. So that there's obviously a lot of other ways, but those are the three main ways that you need to know how it shifts and how crowding out works. Crowding out happens when there's a government deficit and the private actors, the private companies, are not happy with the increase in the real interest. So much time talking about savings and things. Now let's talk money. What is money? Well, we all know what money is, right? Wrong. What is the money's function? Well, the money, why is it important? Why are they just a bunch of pieces of papers? Why are they important? Well, the money is important because they serve three major functions. Medium of exchange. First is medium of exchange, unit of account, and a store of value. And let me explain each one. Medium of exchange. You can use money as something that can exchange things. Well, we all know that, right? Do we also know that it's a unit of account? It functions as something that we can gauge prices with. We can use this to compare. Let's say something is $1, I compare it to something that's $2. I can use this to compare the value of things. Therefore, it is great for us humans to rationally assess things. And finally, the store of value. That's one of the most important functions of money. If a money will lose value the next day, obviously it's not that valuable. If it only functions today, it's not that valuable. But the problem is money should be able to store value over 10, 50, 100 years. In this case, if I take $1 printed 100 years ago, I should still be able to use it today. $1 still use it today. In this case, this is a proof of which the dollar can store value, however much inflation can happen. Now, another characteristic of money is that it has liquidity. Liquidity is basically how easy can you actually use that money. In this case, we can see that in this model, M1, M2 money supply model. What is money supply? Money supply is basically the amount of money in the economy. We can see that the more liquid something is, the more easy it is for you to spend it. The less liquid it is, the less easy it is for you to spend it. In this case, things like M1, they contain things that are very liquid, like currency. You can spend this right away in a store. Go to a store and you can spend it. Saving deposits, checking deposits, and other checkable deposits. You can spend them right away. What is in the M2? Small denomination time deposits and retail money funds. Those are harder to liquidate. In other words, this liquidation is not only just talking about money, it's also talking about assets. How easy is it you can convert an asset to economy's medium of exchange? That's what liquidity means. Now, why is today's money more important than the money before? Why is our paper money better? Well, it's because that we're using fiat money, not what is called the commodity money. What is commodity money? Commodity money is basically gold and silver. Gold and silver is, well, two things that we know are very, very valuable, even till today. They can store value for almost forever. In this case, but they're, first of all, hard to carry around. Second of all, hard to determine what kind of price they actually are. So that's why we invented things like fiat money. These are much more stable type of currency that although they can dysfunction at times when a country collapses, as long as that country stays afloat, usually things like dollar bills are fiat money. And they're far more stable than those two types of commodity money that can change price wildly over time. And it's kind of hard to measure in terms of large quantities. And then we need to also take into account that there's also things like exchanging money, such as World War II. They use cigarettes for money. So there's a lot of things that can be used for money, and this is actually a commodity money because commodity money is something that have intrinsic worth. Coming next is the Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, how they control the supply of money. The Federal Reserve System, often called the Fed, is basically serving as a central bank of the United States. Their job, regulate the supply of money. Now, the below is a bunch of things that you have to remember. It's created in 1913. It has 12 regional banks. Each of them has their own board of directors. The Federal Reserve Board is located in Washington, D.C., not anywhere else, in our nation's capital. And it is consisting of 7 members appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, very much like cabinet members. And the governor's terms are 14 years. But sometimes the president can fire them at will, of course. And there is 12 regional banks that is responsible for overseeing the commercial banks, which are banks that are basically everyday banks, that are not central banks, in their regions, so that they can basically regulate how they are able to lend out and take money. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank also act as a lender of the last resort. For example, if a bank is running out of money, let's say that the Bank of the United States is running out of money, and they're in a very bad position because a lot of people want to get money to withdraw money. So they will go to the federal bank and says, "Hey, I need you to lend me some money so that I can stay afloat and not do a bank run." So that's basically how this works. That's one function of the Federal Reserve, and a widely not so used function because it's a last resort function. Next is its ability to control money supply, and who exactly its responsibility is that? This is something you have to memorize. The Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. It is their job to regulate the money supply, and it is composed of the 7 governors of the Fed plus the 5 regional bank reserves. The president of the New York Fed is always a member. The other 4 places rotate among the remaining banks. Those are informations that you have to memorize, and they meet every 6 weeks in Washington, D.C. to assess the state of the economy and determine if any changes of monetary policy is necessary. In other words, if they need to change the administered interest rate, which in this case is just what they would like the interest rate to be in the economy, and set their own interest rate. And if those people decide that money supply can be adjusted, oh hey, look at their administered rate would be adjusted. Of course, they don't tell you what administered rate actually is. Let me define what administered rate actually is. Let's say that they want to change the rate of which they can lend to the banks. In this case, they would change that rate, and that would be administered rate. It's a rate that is directly adjustable by the central bank. In this case, there are 2 types of rates. Of course, you don't have to know this, but it's first the discount rate, of which, this one you actually need to know because they will talk about it. The discount rate, which actually they talk about over here, when it lowers the discount rate, and the interest rate on reserves, which means that you do have to memorize those 2 types of administered rate. Whenever they adjust the administered rate, they are changing the discount rate and the interest on reserves rate. That's what it is when they talk about adjusting the administered rate. They will usually use the adjustment of administered rate when they are in an ample reserve, when they are conducting ample reserve policy. In this case, if they want to stimulate an economy, they will lower the discount rate. Why do they do that? Why do they do lower discount rate and interest on reserves? Well, let me define what discount rate is and interest on reserve rate is. As I defined before, discount rate is the rate of which the banks, the local banks, will borrow from the central bank. And the interest on reserves is the Fed tells the banks, if you store your money if you store the money that you have in my bank, how much interest am I willing to pay you? In this case, if you lower the interest that you're willing to pay me if I put money in your bank, then obviously I'm not willing to actually put that money in your bank, so that I will actually lend those money out to other people so that they can invest, which stimulates a recessionary economy, of which this actually works the opposite way. If you want to dumb down a expansionary, something that is too much inflation in an economy, you can just reverse this and pick the administered rate up. In this case, people are less likely to borrow. Although this is ample reserve policy, there's 2 types of reserves. There's limited reserve policy, and there is ample limited reserve policy. This reserve policy, it could use administered rate still, but usually they use things like open market operation. Now you would be like, what's open market operation? Open market operation is basically the selling and the buying of government bonds. That's basically just what it is. The selling and buying of government bonds. And why is that important? Because it adjusts the money supply. If you sell bonds, okay, if let's say I'm a citizen and I'm buying a federal bond, that means that the federal government is selling a bond. That means that I'm giving my money that could have been used in circulation to put it into the federal government. In this case, the total money supply within the market decreases, and they achieve their goal. They decrease the money supply, making money more rare, increasing the price on money, which is interest rate. In this case, they successfully change the interest rate by just buying and selling bonds. Of course, this is a less direct way to change the interest rate, but now you know, open market operation, buying and the selling of bonds. Let us learn how to make money. Or should I say specifically, how the bank affect money supply. How do the bank create money? By using this ratio, 1/r. This is what's called a reserve ratio. Reserve ratio. What is a reserve ratio? It's basically the amount of money that the bank decides that they're not going to lend out to other people when they're trying to decide who exactly should they lend money to when investors are coming to them to borrow money. That's what we call the bank multiplier. This is the bank multiplier. How do you use this bank multiplier? Let's say I am an average citizen. I'm a citizen and I want to deposit money to Bank of America. And I deposit $100. I deposit $100. This $100, and let's say the reserve ratio is 5%. 5%. In this case, 1 over 0.05%. And if you take out a calculator and you calculate this, that will turn into $2,000. So in other words, the bank just turned, using this reserve ratio, your $100 into $2,000. But now you were like, wait, how do you turn $100 into $2,000? I want to know that, right? I also want to turn $100 into $2,000. Well, here's a trick that they use. When you get $100 to the bank, now this $100 already existed, so it's part of the system. They keep $5 and they lend out $95. Now they just created $95 in the economy. And you'd be like, that's just $95. But look at what happens next. Next, they also say 5% of 95. 95 times 0.05 equals 4.75. And the rest of the money would be 95 minus 4.75, which is 90.25. And they lend this amount of money out again. So those monies all become part of the money supply. They're all circulating. These two amount of monies are all circulating in the market. And if you split 5% of this off, again, you take 5% away to put it in your reserves once again, and you lend out the rest to another investor. Well, this sounds like a scam, isn't it? But it's not a scam. This is how bank functions under this reserve ratio. Under this reserve ratio, this is how the bank functions. And the money market will generate more and more money because of this reserve multiplier, and it will eventually converge on this number of $2,000 if the ratio is 5%. You're going to save 5% of the total savings that the consumer entrusts in you. In this case, how do we calculate the total money supply then? In this case, how much money supply can the bank actually create? Or how much money supply there actually is in the economy? In this case, we have to consider this equation. 1 over R times M minus C. What is M? M is monetary base. What is monetary base? It's what's called high-powered money. It is basically all the money that is currently in the reserve, all the money that is currently in your reserve, plus the money that is circulating in the economy. In this case, the money circulating in the economy is called currency, and your reserve is actually not called this, it's called M. No, your reserve is still called a reserve. It's just that your reserve, this would equal the monetary base, and your reserve would equal M minus C. Because you subtracted the C on both sides, now the C is on the other side. Therefore, the amount of reserve that you have is M minus C. In other words, how much money is in your vault right now. And given that the money that you use in your vault, that you have in your vault, can be applied with this reserve ratio and then sent to become $2,000, therefore we apply this equation to make it $2,000. And then if we add the currency that is not deposited in banks, that is still in circulation, that is how we get the total monetary base of, that's how we get the monetary base of the economy. And that is also what this grotesque part of algebra is deriving and trying to show you. However, this is in the limited reserve system. Remember, this thing is used in a limited reserve system, which there is reserve requirements. In this case, what happens if the bank actually is willing to lend out all the money that it could? In this case, this reserve ratio is going to be very, very small. This is going to be a very, very small. In this case, let's say the bank is like, I do not care. I do not care. I want to set this to 0.001. That's how much money am I going to keep in the reserve. Now let's plug that 0.001 into the reserve ratio and see how much money that is going to create. Divided by 0.001. That is about $10,000. Now you just got from $100 to $10,000. 10 with 5 zeros that follows behind. Sounds great, right? It's actually not so great, because the more money that you're lending out, the less money you have to give back. In this case, remember, those are not your money. Those are not your money. Those are the money that you have given out. In this case, if they come and ask for this money from you and you don't have enough reserves to pay them, they're going to get panic and they're all going to rush the bank. And what happens at that time is that it's not going to turn out very pretty if they all come at the same time and you have no money. In that case, your bank would go bankrupt. Which is why they set a reserve requirement, the minimum amount of reserves that you have to hold to ensure that nothing would actually go wrong. But what the US did is that the US is operating on an ample reserve system, so it is not bounded by the reserve ratio. The reserve requirement is 0% in 2020. And this is specifically issued by, again, FOMC. Why? Because the US has transitioned to an ample reserve system. But wait, why is that the case? Well, an ample reserve system usually indicates that the bank already is. A lot of banks are already solvent. In other words, a solvent bank have a whole lot of money. In other words, you can go to them almost at any time and they will be quite safe for you to make sure that you can take out some money. So that's what the US has opted for. In this case, the reserve ratio will be just meaningless. In the US, there's no such thing as reserve requirements anymore, ever since 2020. There's no such thing as reserve requirements anymore. But you still have to know this term for the test. And of course, there is the discount rate that we talked about before, and I don't think we need to explain it any further as to how the central bank uses the discount rate. But for the federal funds rate, this is another one of the rates. So many rates, right? This is very closely linked to discount rate. What is this rate? It's basically the rate of which one bank can borrow to another bank. That's the interest rate that one bank charges for another bank. And this bank is specifically not the central bank. It's not the central. It's a commercial bank. This is a commercial bank. It's not the central bank. It's not the Fed. So that's what federal funds rate is. It's very much like the discount rate, only you're not borrowing from a federal bank, but from a commercial bank. And the next one is what we're going to talk about, why the reserve ratio is necessary in a limited reserve system. Bank runs. When people are scared that you're not going to pay their money back, they will rush the bank. Let's say I'm scared that if I go any later, the bank is going to shut down and it's not going to pay back what I has stored in it. It's not going to let me withdraw my deposits. In that case, I'll be very scared and I would go to the bank and I would knock on their door and say, give my money back. And imagine if that leads to a panic and everyone just decides to rush the bank at the same time. The bank obviously does not keep enough reserve to respond to that. In other words, they will go bankrupt. That would not be good for the bank or for the people who entrusted the bank with their money. Summarize what this whole chunk of text is just talking about. What it's talking about is that if you increase the amount of money, increase money supply, in the long run, all it's going to do is to increase. All it's going to do in the long run is it's going to increase the price level. That's literally all it's going to do. It's not going to increase your real GDP. It's not going to increase anything else other than the price level. And what is an increase in the price level? That's inflation. That's literally all this thing is talking about here. And we actually drawn up an equation to prove this. What is that equation? MV equals YP. Now you're like, what exactly does each symbol mean? Now you might have seen this before. That's the real GDP. Real GDP. This is P, price level. This is V. What's V? Velocity of money. Now, what's velocity of money? That's something that's very new, isn't it? It's basically how much time money change hands. A typical times a dollar bill would change hands in a year. It's about 2 or 3 actually it's about a little bit more than 1 in America right now currently, but that's not something you need to memorize. And M is just money supply. M is just money supply. Now, this identity holds. Why exactly does this identity hold? Let me explain. Let's say you have a money supply of $100. That $100 is going to be exchanged how many times? And when is money exchanged? When people spend it. If a $100 bill is exchanged 2 times per year, that means that that person spent 200. That there's at least $200 of spending within the economy, which means that we just got the spending within the economy. And what is this? Well, previously this is categorized mainly as the real GDP, but this is really the output, the total amount of output. In other words, the total quantity of output times the price level. What is quantity times price level? That's GDP, right? So this is really output. Let's save real GDP for later. This is output. Let's call this output. We call this output and call this price level. In this case, quantity times price level. What is it? It's the total amount of production each year. This is the real GDP. This is the real GDP. Now, what is this? This is also the real GDP because it's the total amount of money that is spent each year. And we know that one person's spending is another person's income, while also those spending has to be spent somewhere, so they have to be spent on the output. And those so therefore this identity really it holds. It's an equal sign between the two. Now let's analyze what will happen. What is this thing actually saying? What this thing is saying is that what happens in an economy when you increase the money supply is that the velocity money in the long run is not going to change. This is not going to change. Not going to change. The output is not going to be changed by the amount of money you have in the economy because whichever way you think about it, why would printing extra papers of money make you want to produce more? But in this case, the only thing that could logically change is just the price level. In other words, a change in money supply would logically only lead to an increase in price. That's why printing money wouldn't work in a long run. This is also called the neutrality of money. The money is not going to influence the output in the long run. You can only influence the output by getting better technology and human capital. There's no way around it. That's what this entire chunk of text is trying to convey. Next is why worry about inflation. Why do we worry about inflation? I mean, why should we care? Isn't inflation showing an expanding economy, therefore it is good? Actually, it is not so good. Let me show you why. Because let's say you hold $100 in your retirement account. And that retirement account, let's say, actually you don't hold it in a retirement account. You hold a $100 bill, you tuck it under the carpet. Because you do not trust the bank. Okay, you grew up during the Great Depression, you don't trust the bank. So I stuck it under my carpet. I find it let's say I find it 80 years later. I find it 80 years later. Would that $100 worth the same thing as back during the 1930s? It absolutely would not. Therefore, inflation actually would cause a lot of harm to the savers. That is basically what happens and is bad about it, because the prices will increase. The relative prices won't increase, but it reduces the value of money. Now you can buy less things with the same $100 bill, which is not good at all for savers. And second, it would introduce distortions into the pricing, because to take account of inflation all the time is very tiring. For the firms to actually have to adjust to inflation is very tiring. And the information that is due to these constant adjustments of price is going to be very tiring. And finally, it introduces pretty much the same concept as to what the true value of goods and services will be in the future, because now inflation makes it less predictable. There's always inflation, right? It's always going to rise. So I can't use the present as a reference point for the future anymore. And a lot of times we can't forecast the rate of inflation. So yeah, we have to worry about inflation quite a lot. And that's what makes inflation so unpopular. We do not want to see things we do not want to see goods get more and more expensive. That's why we hate inflation. So let's talk about the short-run economic fluctuations. So what are the short-run economic fluctuations? We actually talked about this before. It's expansions and recessions, which you see over here. Or really, that doesn't really affect the US economy, but it shows the business cycle. It's basically a business cycle, but on the aggregate level. Expansion, recession. Expansion, recession. And then expansion again. That's basically the short-run fluctuations. And what we have to remember is that there's a thing called the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a board that is trying to record the amount of recessions and expansions in the economy that is pretty credible. And according to them, it's recession is a period between a peak and a trough in economic activity, and as mentioned before, expansion is a period of trough and a peak. That's pretty much all you need to know for this portion. And after this, what you need to know for the characteristics of those peak and trough and peaks. Well, what's the characteristics of an expanding economy? What is the characteristic of expansion? Expansion have lower unemployment rates. Unemployment rate decrease during expansion, decrease. And what happens is that real GDP, or no, not real GDP, inflation will increase. Now, what happens if it is a recession? What happens if it's recessionary? Then unemployment would increase, and inflation would in turn decrease. Those are the ultimate characteristics that is determined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Those are the characteristics after they studied everything. They determined this pattern within the economy. And after that, let's talk about the potential output and the real outputs. So the potential output is what they signified as a Y star. This is the potential of the economy, obviously, but it's the potential at full employment. In other words, it's the economy's full performance. And there's a thing called output gap. What is an output gap? It's basically Y, which is the real rate of real output, minus the full potential output. In other words, this output gap is calculating how much are you away from full potential. How much is your economy away from full potential, which is Y star. In this case, well, first let's determine what's the characteristics of this Y star to make sure to know why this Y star is really important. In this case, the unemployment ratio would be only frictional and structural. If it is at Y star, then only frictional and structural unemployment should occur, and those are the natural rate of unemployments. In this case, as long as there's no things like cyclical component, there shouldn't be a negative output gap existing here. If it is in a recession, there will be a negative output gap. If it is in not a recession, an expansion, if it is in an expansion, then it's going to get a positive output gap because this is going to be bigger. The current output would be bigger in an expansion than potential output because you're doing above potential, which is usually what the US is doing. Now, there's another thing that you have to memorize over here. It's Arthur Okun. Early 1960s, he presented something such as the Okun's Law. In this case, he states the relationship between cyclical unemployment, which is a bad unemployment, which if it increases by 1%, the output gap would rise from 2 to 4%. In other words, the output gap would increase at 2 times speed of the cyclical unemployment. The more cyclical unemployment there is, the higher the output gap. In this case, it will be a negative output gap because the current would be, in this case, Y would be lower than Y star for it to have cyclical unemployment and recession because you're operating below potential if you're having an output gap that is negative. Why there is actually short-run fluctuations. In other words, why is Y different? Why is it different from Y star in the short run? What causes it to be different? Well, it's different because there's this thing that exists called sticky price. Prices are sticky. It's hard to change price in a very short amount of period of time because there's literally price stickers on there that you can't take off on a very short term. It's also hard to adjust to the economy constantly. There's always a lagging period of which you have to change the price, and also there's an issue with the output, of which the amount of input to produce the output cannot be adjusted instantly. It cannot be adjusted instantly. So the input price is a problem, sticky input price, sticky price as a whole. In the short run, you can't adjust them. In the long run, you could adjust them, and eventually the supply would become normal and the output would become Y star. But in the short run, you can't do that. And one of the great models that is developed in our section is John Maynard Keynes. And you have to remember this guy. He wrote a 1936 book about the general theory of employment, interest, and money. Now, this is an important book, really important, because it is trying to account for why the heck the entire Great Depression thing happened. And therefore, the model that he developed also is called the Keynesian model. What does it look like? Well, it looks like this thing. This is a Keynesian model. Aggregate demand, short-run aggregate supply, and long-run aggregate supply, one of the most famous models in the economy. And this is the aggregate. What exactly does aggregate mean? It means that everything is added together. As we have discussed before, there's two curves. One is aggregate demand. The other one is short-run aggregate supply. And finally, there's this thing called long-run aggregate supply, of which we will also talk about later. But right now, in the short run, let's consider these two curves. Now, first of all, let's consider the aggregate demand curve. What is this? It's basically all of the consumptions, all of what you want to consume added together. So what is it exactly? It's consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. It's the demand on all goods. So it's basically GDP. Hence why real GDP is on the y-axis. It's literally how much you demand, the total economy that you demand. And the first thing that we have to justify about this curve and know how to justify is why exactly is this thing negative? Why is the aggregate demand curve negative here, downward sloping? Well, there are three effects: wealth, interest rate, and foreign exchange. We have to account for its wealth effects. Now, what are we trying to prove here? We're trying to prove that a decline in price will actually cause, the decline of price will cause an increase in aggregate demand. Well, let's prove it. Let's say price declines, price level declines. You, as a consumer, would see this price and feel like you're more wealthy because now you can buy more stuff. $1 now, as price level decline, can buy more stuff. Therefore, as price level declines, aggregate demand would increase. Now, here's the second reason as to why aggregate demand is downward sloping. The second reason is that if the price level is lowered, people will have more disposable income. They would have more money. I would have more money in my pockets. What do I do with that more money? If I don't spend it, I will save it. What happens if I save it? Now, if I save this money over here, they go into the loanable funds market because I put them in a bank. Let's say I put them in a bank and now they're out for loans. Now that increases the supply of loans. As we go up, let's go to the loanable funds market curve. What happens if we increase the supply of loans? As you can see, the interest rate will decrease. A decline in interest rate. What happens when the interest rate declines? Let's take this from a company's perspective. If I see the interest rate declining, I would want to invest more because I want to borrow more. Now I'm willing to borrow. I'm very willing to borrow. Less interest rate, heck yes. I am very willing to borrow. In this case, given that we already established the aggregate demand curve is basically the aggregate of the GDP of the economy, then this investment will increase. Therefore, the aggregate demand as price drops will increase. As we can see, negative. And the final one is the foreign exchange, which have to do with net exports and net imports. If, let's say, the price level within our economy lowers, this will make our goods more attractive. Why? Because relative to other countries' goods, let's say a pair of shoe. Let's say originally a pair of shoe in our country is $1. Wow, that's a very cheap pair of shoe. And in the UK, it's also $1. Now our country decides that our price level is going to go down. It's going to go down to $0.9. Now all the Brits are like, hey, look at that $0.9. I want that $0.9. Why would I buy domestically? In other words, the British would flock to this $0.9 and decides that they're all going to want American-made shoes, which is great. Made in America, yay. And in that case, our demand would increase. This is foreign demand. In this case, as the price level drops, and this doesn't just have to be for shoe. This can be anything. This can be for refrigerators. Let's say the general price level even drops. Our general price level drops relative to the UK. UK is more likely to buy from us in this scenario. Therefore, our aggregate demand increases. And those three reasons are the three main reasons as to why the aggregate demand is downward sloping up a little bit and talk about how the aggregate demand curve would shift, because we all know every single curve shifts some way, somehow. Let's discuss how the aggregate demand shifts. Now, aggregate demand shifts when any of those four factors, consumption, investment, governmental purchases, and net exports, changed. And let's give an example of each one. Let's say consumer confidence increases. Consumer confidence increase. Oh, I can't write. All right. Let's say if consumer confidence increase. If consumer confidence increase, they're willing to demand more. In other words, AD will shift to the left, and vice versa if it decreases. And next, if there's new technology developed, then investment would increase because now there's more opportunity in the economy because the technology has been new. In other words, the investment would increase. If the investment increases, aggregate demand increases. Next, if we also see the governmental purchases, if the government decides to do a budget increase, if the government decides, I'm going to spend more money on this project, it's also going to increase the aggregate demand by shifting it to the right, and vice versa. If it wants to do budget cuts, it will shift to the left. And finally, if there's net exports, for example, if the foreign income increased, if the British people has more income now, they are more willing to spend money. In other words, they're more willing to spend money on other countries' goods, such as the U.S., one of our top trading partners, and our aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And vice versa, if their income decreases, they're less willing to afford our goods, therefore it will shift to the left in that circumstance. So those are some examples of how AD curves, aggregate demand curves, can shift. Now let's talk about the aggregate supply curve. This figure also illustrates an aggregate supply curve, and we can see that it is positively sloped. And as mentioned before, why is it positively sloped? Well, first of all, because it's obviously short run. But another reason is that it has sticky input price. Sticky price. It's sticky. The price is sticky. They can't change the price in the short run. So what can they do? All they can do is that they can change the amount of supply that they actually give. What exactly is that supposed to mean? So let's consider a company that hires 100 workers and have, let's say, those 100 workers cost you the input price of, let's say, $1,000. They're quite cheap, right? $1,000 a day. All right, now you figure that you can't support those 100 workers. But those 100 workers are contracted to you. There's a thing called contract that they sign. They contract you for a month. You can't just fire them whenever you want. So if you want to actually fire them or reduce costs, you actually have to wait till the end of the month. So what exactly do I as a producer do in order to make sure that I still earn the maximum amount of profits? In that case, I would reduce my output rather than my price, because that makes my input price sticky. And my output is not sticky. I can supply as much as I want and keep the rest in my inventory. Therefore, as price level increase, I'm willing to supply more still. If price level decrease, I'm willing to supply less. So the output is the only thing I can change. And what is output? Real GDP, as we discussed before. Output is real GDP. But in the long run, it will become vertical. Why? Because I don't need to change the output in the long run. In the long run, I'll just produce however much the economy needs, ideally, because then I would be able to, let's say, I'll fire a few workers at the end of the month. I'll fire them. In that case, I do not need to adjust my output. My output is always going to be constant, regardless of the price. In that case. And that's why the short-run aggregate supply curve is positively sloped, just like the regular supply curve is. Let's discuss why this thing is actually positive. Let's discuss what can actually make it shift around. Well, there's 3 reasons as provided by this book. First is that the expected price level has increased. For example, if this expected price level increase, the ASSR, surprisingly, will actually go to the left. Why does it go to the left? I mean, you just expected more. You just expected a higher price level, right? You just expected a higher price level than this. Well, the main reason why it shifts to the left is that, you see, I have to meet the expectation. The ASSR will shift to the left to meet this expectation. As you can see, it wants to intersect with the aggregate demand so that it can meet this kind of price expectation. In this case, the long-run aggregate supply will actually look like this to meet this expectation. Obviously, the long-run aggregate supply is not going to shift. What's going to shift is the ASSR. And as to how the long-run aggregate supply will shift, we'll discuss that later. But if I actually expected more out of you consumers, I will be like, hey, I expected more from you consumers. Therefore, if I expected even more, I would decrease my supply because I don't feel worth it. I feel worth even less supplying you guys. And next part is basically the input costs. If my input costs skyrocket, I'll be even less willing to produce because now you're paying me the same amount and I have to produce as much. There's no way. Or my profit margin is my marginal cost is rising way too fast because of this input cost. Therefore, it will shift to the left again, and vice versa if input costs decrease. Then the last one is supply shock, and the most well-known supply shock is the oil embargo. If there's an oil embargo, oil prices increase. That's a very reasonable input cost shift to the left. Input cost just increased. So that's the three main reasons: supply shock, input cost increase, and the expected price level increasing. And know that the expected price level is the first and the most common type, is described as the most common cause of shifts in the position of aggregate supply curve. So if they asked what's the most common cause, it's the shift in the supply curve. It's the shift in the price expectation. And in addition to this short run fluctuation, there is this thing called long run fluctuation. What exactly shifts this long run fluctuation curve? We can see over here, this is long run vertical over here. How exactly does this thing shift? Well, if this thing shifts, let's say shift to the right, what it takes for this thing to shift is either a betterment of technology, a betterment of human capital, or a betterment of governmental regulation. In this case, if the technology is better, then we're able to produce more with the same resource. If the human capital, if the humans are smarter because they got more school, in this case, each person will be able to produce more. Or if the government decides to do a more productive style of governing, the companies can use that government to produce more, because now, for example, there's less regulation. They can produce more. All right, now this entire next section just talks about many different examples of how it could shift, of which you can check them out yourself. I already explained a lot of reasons, and those are probably included in there. I'll use their examples. And finally, inflations in the Keynesian model. Now, what it's trying to illustrate is that if an inflation is anticipated, the economy will still be on the long run, will still meet, let's say this line is a long run aggregate supply curve, it will still be at the long run. In other words, it won't be a disturbance. Let's test this idea out. Let's say we're going to use this equation, quantity equation, I think that's what it's called, quantity equation. Y, please, well, that's basically, let's say if I increase the monetary by 3%, I increase the money supply by 3%. Now let's say you didn't expect this, therefore the price did not change at this current moment. The aggregate demand, as we have seen, because you give people more money, they're willing to buy more. Therefore, now since they're going to intersect at this point, notice that this is the first ASSR, so they're now going to intersect at this point. Y actually increased in this instance. The Y has increased, which is the output. The output actually increased because of the money supply increase in the short run. But notice that's in the short run. But let's say the economy actually anticipated this inflation. They anticipated that you're going to increase the monetary, that they anticipated this 3% increase. Now what's going to happen? As we have discussed before, one of the reasons why ASSR, and the most common reason why it would shift, is that it anticipated the prices to increase. Therefore, ASSR will shift backward. It will shift backward back to this long-run aggregate supply. In this case, the price level would increase by 3%, and the increase in money supply would have essentially done nothing. In this case, it would just be a 3% inflation, and nothing else changes over here on the aggregate demand aggregate supply model besides the price. That's what this section is trying to talk about. Back to the government, how they're going to use fiscal and monetary policy to fix our economy, to stabilize our economy. Now let's differentiate what fiscal policy and monetary policy is. Now you are already familiar with monetary policy because we already talked about the Fed. So the Fed is the monetary policy. The central bank controls the monetary policy. But what is fiscal policy? You must have heard this word before, but if you read the news, fiscal policy is government policy, central government. In other words, the White House, the Congress. The White House and the Congress decides what the fiscal policy is. And what exactly does it do? Well, G, it's the government. It influences the aggregate demand by being the government itself. It is literally part of aggregate demand. Now, the exact way it influences, it has pretty much two methods: expansionary or contractionary. When it's trying to be expansionary, it would decrease the amount of tax cuts, right? Next, it would increase the amount of things like transfer payments. Transfer payments increase, well, it's the same font. Transfer payments would be increased. Let me do this in another color. Transfer payments would be increased, and governmental spending will be increased. You increase the government spending while lowering the amount of money you tax people. In this case, the consumers would have more money to spend because you're taxing them less. They have more disposable income. AD, in this case, will shift to the right. And again, if you increase the amount of government spending you do, AD will again shift to the right. That's expansionary fiscal policy. As you can see, it's very expansionary because if, let's say, this is the aggregate supply curve, look at how many times from the original spot the output has increased. A whole lot, right? That's expansionary, to expand the economy so that there's more output. Now, what happens when you do contractionary? So you basically just do the opposite. You increase the amount of taxes, tax people more, decrease the amount of transfer payments, although I don't think they talk about that, and decrease the amount of government spending. Now, what happens now is that, well, you increase the amount of our taxes, right? Now I'm not willing to spend. As a consumer, I'm not willing to spend as much because I have less income. Aggregate demand decrease. You decrease the amount of government spending. In this case, it would directly cause this to decrease, directly cause Y, the real GDP, to decrease. In this case, you are the demand, decrease in aggregate demand. And let's say this is the aggregate supply. Look at how much the output has dropped because of this contractionary fiscal policy. So therefore, the fiscal policy is basically a way to manipulate output, the way the government manipulate the output. Remember to exclude the Fed. It's not the Federal Reserve Board. They're doing nothing here. They're not doing fiscal policy. The government is the central government, the White House, the Congress. They determine the amount of taxes you're going to pay. And it's using taxes and government spending. Remember that. Next is monetary policy. Monetary policy, as we talked about before, is directly from the Fed. And if you want a short summary again, the Fed basically decides the rate of which you have to pay. If you at any time hear about the rate, it's the Fed. The Fed controls the rate. The central government, the fiscal policy got nothing to do with the rate. If the Fed is trying to be expansionary, then they would decrease the amount of rate. They would decrease the rate, administered rate specifically, a rate. They would decrease this. If they want to do expansionary, they would increase this rate. The Fed will usually never do open market operations, although open market operation is part of monetary policy, because as mentioned before, open market operation is only for limited reserves. Our federal government is on ample reserve system. They cannot use this open market operation. As for why, please take AP Economics, Macroecon. This packet doesn't go deep enough into discussing why OMO is not used in ample system. And finally, we had to make a judgment call here. Is all this thing good? Should the government intervene with accordance to the shifts in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? Should the Federal Reserve intervene in this? Well, the answer is really mixed. Depends on your perspective. So here's a final takeaway if the government should actually involve itself or not. If the government decides to involve itself, then it needs data. But the problem is, data doesn't come instantly. We're not working in a techno-dystopia here. So not all data are collected very fast. In fact, data usually come very late. So we have to, even if we try to get data beforehand, before it's completely researched, it's going to be inaccurate. It's not going to be very accurate. That's the first problem. It's not accurate. The data is we simply do not know if the data is accurate or not. And it simply takes too long. And even if the data comes instantly, guess what our government is best at? Our government is best at making long times to make decisions. The Congress needs to take a whole lot of time to make decisions. So the moment they have actually passed a bill, make this decisions, even if they acted quick, it will probably take like 4 or 5 months until they actually pass it. That at that time we don't even know if that, first of all, if that data originally the policy was decided on was accurate. Second, we don't know if that policy after it's implemented is still going to we're still going to be in the original state of which that data originally predicted us to be. And finally, this policy takes time to show effect. So at the moment of which the federal government has already, for example, did an expansionary policy, the economy may have already been expanding, may have already gotten out of this recession and started expanding. And if that is the case, then that would be horrible, because then it would overshoot that limit and send us into runaway inflation, and that's the problem. So really, if the government should or should not intervene, although it looks like it should be their job, it is questionable as to whether they can do their job well or not, and that is a normative judgment mentioned in Section 1. And that is the final conclusion of Section 3 of macroeconomics. If you want to learn more information, you can take AP Macroeconomics. It teaches everything here, and it's super fun. And that concludes the page-by-page economic section resource guide explanations. Thank you for watching and sticking to the end.